Okay, brilliant. So, yeah, I'd just like to kind of start off by saying that I'm actually one of the people that Michael referred to earlier as kind of not really an expert in online learning, but was thrown into it very quickly. So what I hope to do in this talk is to share my experience of pretty much adapting overnight to moving to teaching online, hopefully share some tips, and actually please do contribute in the chat or the Q&A if you think there's any gaps in what I've done, or if you want to take on board any of the advice I've got. So that'd be great. Okay, so just another disclaimer. So I'm going to try and make this to be not a very technical talk. So what I'd like to focus on is the kind of general principles and ideas behind what I've done, rather than technically how I did it. I happen to use Teams. That is mainly because that's the preferred video conferencing tool at Nottingham. But by all means, if you prefer to use Zoom or Adobe Connect or various other tools that have been discussed over the last couple of days, then by all means do that. So I'll say what I did in Teams to give you an idea, but all of these ideas can be generalized. So you can see the broad list of topics I'll be talking through there. So we'll get on. So just to set the scene, so the webinars that I'm going to talk about were for the Year 1 students who I do a lot of the teaching support for. So it's specifically in their core modules. So things like calculus, linear algebra, that sort of thing. These typically would run as face-to-face sessions, so 2 or 3 hours a week in hour-long sessions. So what I wanted to do as much as possible was to recreate a similar environment to what I would have done in the face-to-face sessions. So again, just to give you an idea of the size, there are about 300 registered students on these modules. Typically between 10 and 20 turn up to these drop-ins, so they're entirely optional. It's not necessarily always the same 10 or 20 students, but that's pretty much the number I get turning up. But amazingly, the numbers went up at the webinars. So I typically had between 30 and 50. So that was one kind of uptick straight away. Yeah, so just this is my particular setup. So I'm fortunate enough to have a couple of devices. So I was using my laptop with the webcam and microphone as I am now to run Teams. Then I also had a Microsoft Surface Pro where I use a stylus for writing maths. Software-wise, so you've probably got the idea now, I use Teams for all of this stuff. Then there's a service called Microsoft Stream, which actually I use for sharing the recordings. I'll say a bit more about that later. I saw a few people in the chat talked about this, so I use Drawable PDF to write notes on blank paper or to annotate some existing notes. And I also did run some computing webinars. We happen to use MATLAB, so I would be running that as well. Okay, so I think the best way to do this is to kind of talk you through the process. So before the webinar, so those of you that are familiar with Teams, well, it's kind of self-explanatory. You can set up a team if you like. So what that means is you can create, essentially it's similar to a forum, but with a few more features where you can specifically add the students for the module or the class. I've put optional because I happen not to do this for this group of students. So whether you set up the team or not, you can set up a Teams meeting. So you can do this just by setting up an Outlook calendar event, or you can do that directly through Teams. And that's basically how you invite the students to the session. So again, there's lots of analogs for doing that with other software. So a tip that I learned along the way was when you invite the students by email, don't assume that they will be able to just add that to their calendar. So they'll be using a variety of maybe Google Calendar or Outlook or iCal or whatever. Some of them realize they can just add it to their calendar, but what I did just to be double sure is just to put the date and the time of the session in the actual text of the invite. What I also did was I send the students an update, like a newsletter every week. So I would send a schedule for the following week of what sessions were coming up. So I tried not to plan too far in ahead so that they forgot, but just enough so they had lots of different ways of finding out when the sessions were happening. I also kind of shared the information with colleagues, so if they were sending anything, so module lecturers, for example, could share the details. So again, those of you familiar with Teams will know what this means. So an optional thing you can do if you, depending on how bureaucratic you want to be, you can change things in the meeting for whether the, students can share their screen or not, or I put that as optional because that really depends on how exactly you want the session to run. You might well want students to share their screen during. Okay. So during the webinar, so I signed into the meeting, so it's possible to do this on most of these. So it's certainly possible on Zoom and Teams. That's about as far as I know. You can sign in multiple times. So the way that I did this, I signed in on the laptop, so the one I'm using now for having the webcam and the microphone, and also so I could keep an eye on the chat. And then I also signed in separately on my Surface Pro so I could write notes on there and then share the screen from the Surface Pro. So that would be what would appear for the students and for me, actually, so I could see what the students could see from the other laptop. I advise the students to ask questions, interact using the chat. So similar to what we're doing now. I would actually, it'd be brilliant if Teams had a version of the Q&A that we're using today. That would actually be quite nice. There's a raise hand option, just like there is on Zoom. And I do say to students, you can use that if you want to turn on your microphone and speak. But as you might imagine, nobody has done that. They're very active on the chat, but not so much on the microphone. Probably understandable. So I do generally record the sessions. That's actually at the student's request. Okay, I've got a tip followed by a warning. So I realized as I wrote the tip that it ought to come with a health warning. So I kind of learned that because for posterity, if you're recording the session, it's actually quite useful for the chat to appear in the recording. So it's in real time, so that when I'm kind of responding to questions, I can, so that anybody watching the video later can see what I was actually responding to. Well, it's certainly in Teams, the only way to do that is to actually record the whole desktop and make sure the chat is active. But of course, if you're sharing your whole desktop, the warning is, make sure you close down your emails and any other, if you happen to be in the middle of marking, you probably don't want to share that with all students, and especially if it's being recorded. So if you don't think it's worth the risk, then don't do it or don't record it at all. But that's really entirely up to you. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, so this is a screen grab, not the most flattering still image of me there, but never mind. This is a screen grab from one of the webinars. So you can see actually at the time I was experimenting using BitPaper, so other software is available than Drawboard PDF. But as you can see, what's visible on the screen is me writing out some maths. You can see me in the bottom right there, and you can see the chat. So that means that's kind of useful at the time for people watching it, but also if you're watching this video afterwards, you can kind of see everything that's going on in real time. So afterwards, so again, this is something probably specific to Teams, but possibly other things as well. So the chat, even after the webinar has ended, that is actually still available. So students, if they kind of think an hour after the webinar, they want to ask a question, they could use the chat to do that. But of course, that means you've got to monitor the chat. So another tip is, set some expectations. So what I kind of came down to in the end with this was I said to students, I would keep an eye on it for about a day after the webinar. But after that, if they really had a burning question, then they could send it by email. But I wasn't just going to keep monitoring all these chats. So setting expectations is very important with these things. I then would share the recording via Microsoft Stream. So that actually happens automatically if you record within Microsoft Teams. That's very nice and easy. You just have to share the link with the students. There's a few buttons you have to press to make sure it's available to students who didn't turn up, but I promise this wasn't a technical talk, so I won't go into the details of how you do that. One nice thing you can do though for organizing videos, if you've got multiple modules or multiple focuses for each of the sessions, you can set up a channel, so similar to YouTube channels, and that looks something like this. So here's the core webinars. And it means this is kind of my editor view, so I can change the order in which they come. So if you don't necessarily want them to be in the order they were recorded, these happen to be in reverse order by record date, but you can change that around. And there are some basic video editing things you can do in Stream as well, like you can cut bits of the video out. I mean, you can't really do much beyond that, but of course you could download the video, edit it, and then re-upload it if you're that bothered. Okay. So I did actually do a bit of rapid evaluation of this last week. So 19 students very kindly replied to a survey during the exam period for me, which was just gave me some indication of how it went. So I'm not by any means going to claim this as a proper evaluation, because it was just some quick kind of agree, disagree statements that I gave the students to fill in, just to give me a flavour. And it was interesting. So I mean, there's some very mixed responses for some questions. So I kind of tried to provoke them to so using words like engaging. So I wasn't really that surprised. So there's lots of students that feel very strongly that these were more engaging than in-person sessions, but equally there's some that didn't think so. I thought this was an interesting one about that I found it easier to ask questions in webinars than in-person sessions. So I certainly found it easier to get students to ask questions from my perspective, but then it's a slightly kind of more mixed response from students. So maybe they just don't like asking questions either way. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting response. I mean, the good news is that everybody enjoyed them. Typically, everyone found them useful. And I kind of asked two very similar questions about, thinking forward. So they unanimously agreed that webinars would be useful for online teaching if online teaching continues, which is good news. So these would be in addition to other online sessions that they have. And actually, pretty much everybody also agreed, maybe not so strongly, that they would find them useful in addition to in-person teaching. So that's quite good news for me, because I quite enjoy giving them. And actually, I think I've kind of happened upon, particularly for computing teaching support, a mechanism for giving support to more students. So I think it'd be interesting for this kind of thing to carry on even when in-person teaching resumes. Okay, right. So just a few qualitative responses. So there was a couple of really interesting points that I want to pick out from these that the students raised. So they really like sharing the screen. So they like seeing exactly what I was doing alongside the explanations. That was important. I quite like the point here about, so we've got a student who's got anxiety, and they actually said they prefer going to the online webinar to ask for help than going to the in-person one. So that was quite a nice response to have there. Then, sort of a more of a mixed comment here, who makes, so a student making the point that nothing will actually compare to the in-person sessions, but actually they're a good second option. So I think, looking back to what I was thinking about, should I replace all of my drop-ins with these? Probably not, because actually the mixed response from students says that they like the online sessions, but I think only if coupled with in-person sessions. I think completely losing that face-to-face contact would be a bad thing. And actually, this leads me on to another tip here, this response here. I think this is a really interesting point made by a student, saying actually leaving time for students to type out questions is important. So they were saying, this was a part of a much longer comment, saying that they went to some other online sessions where the lecturer would stop to ask if anyone had any questions, but then kind of gave the same amount of time that you would for people to put their hands up in the lecture theatre rather than waiting for a question to be typed. So I think, a tip there is actually wait for a decent amount of time for students to type questions. So I just kind of want to give you a few takeaways from this, the key things I think that are important. So if anyone was in Ben's talk yesterday, I completely contradicted him here. So I think this really it probably comes down to what you feel comfortable with. And so the students, they told me that they found it really quite nice that they could see me talking even while I was writing the maths. So they didn't see it as a distraction, but something nice to look at. Just to kind of feel like they were somehow in the room with me rather than just looking at a ghost writing some maths. Chalk and talk, I think, is really important. So the students liked the fact that I was writing as I was speaking. So rather than just using pre-prepared slides, all of these webinars were either done with me doing live coding, if it was a computing session, or starting with a blank piece of paper and writing as I was talking. So it regulates how quickly I was talking. This point was made in a few sessions yesterday. But also, again, it just makes it feel more like it's a tutorial rather than just a lecture. So that kind of leads to the last one, which is, being interactive. So having long pauses to wait for students to type into the chat. I asked questions as well, and students would give me some answers in the chat, and then they would start talking to each other. So you're kind of instigating that peer-to-peer interaction as well. And I think making it feel like that is really, really important. And also don't plan too much. So I would usually plan for me to speak for probably about 20 minutes within an hour, because I knew that loads of other things would come up in the chat. And again, I think the students liked that. They felt like they had the opportunity to have a dialogue rather than just one-way traffic. So the main lessons I've learned, I think, is to be adaptable. So you've already seen I've used bit paper, I've used drawable PDF. I've tried out lots of different ways of doing it, figured out how to get the recording right, that sort of thing. And find the right combination for you. So if what I've done doesn't work for you, that's fine. It's just about adapting. Setting expectations. I've already made this point. So good communication before, during, and after the webinar for students is really, really important. So they know what they're supposed to get out of the session, what they're supposed to do with it afterwards as well. And I think a really important thing. So I felt completely out of my depth when I first realised. So that first few hours when I was trying to plan all this stuff. And I think if there's one thing you can take away as a message, students are much more patient than you are with yourself. So whatever you do, no matter how big or small, the students will just appreciate that you're doing something to facilitate their learning. So even if you feel like it's not perfect, or you could have done better, the students don't often think that. So do just be patient. Okay, so I think I'm just about on time there. So thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, that was brilliantly done, Tom. Anyone would have thought you kind of prepared. Like saying "don't plan too much" was a kind of a phrase I took from the end. Thank you. I think, well, thank you very much for that contribution. I think those kind of top tips and things that you'd sort of realised are sort of really quite helpful and resonate with many people. I think you're also going to be busy responding to some of the questions, and if you find you're not, do help out Christian, who's still working hard on that as we speak. I pulled out a few themes, if that's okay, and I'll try and group as many together as possible. But there's a number of kind of questions coming up around, do students appear on the video? Are they able to kind of contribute audio, or is it sort of very much they're there and it's you kind of speaking?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, if I just go back to that, so that was a typical screen grab. So, I mean, you can see there is one person with a picture there. I don't think that's genuine. But yeah, so typically, so they can appear on video. So it's not like the session we're in now where it's been restricted. So and occasionally one or two might appear on video, but most of them just decided not to. And like I said, I already invited them to use the raise hand feature to contribute on the microphone if they wanted to. But typically they just didn't. They were very, very active on the chat, and I was trying to keep an eye on how many students were in. So which students were in the participants list, and then which ones were talking in the chat, just to see, were there any kind of silent. There was a few students who just came and didn't really actively engage, but were, they were there for the whole thing anyway. But actually, it was usually more than half. So more than half of the people in the room were contributing in the chat, even though they weren't doing it with their voice. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe part of it is because, these are students who have spent all year learning in one way. Now they're learning in a new way. Perhaps when we start with the first years this autumn, things might be different because they don't know they're not allowed to speak. So, yeah.
Thanks, Tom. I think there's sort of some interesting points. There was a comment or a question from Deirdre that, within their institution, they require students to be anonymous. So, clearly there are all those sort of things to think about, but it seems like, students are choosing to be anonymous in many ways, but will interact via a sort of an anonymous opportunity if that's the case. Tom, how much work did you put into kind of the administration in organising these sessions? This is a question from Sarah Santos.
So early on, quite a lot, mostly because I kept getting it wrong and I had to keep doing it again. But then by the time I was into about my third week of doing them, it was minutes to set each one up. It was mainly just, and often what I would do, I'd just copy and paste a calendar entry from the previous week. So once I got the hang of it, it was not much time at all, because, in terms of the actual delivery of the session, I gave as many hours each week as I would have done to the in-person sessions. So in terms of overhead on top of that, very little actually, once you've figured out how it all works.
And then final question, if I may, which has come in from Gemma Shipton, which is, you mentioned in there, Tom, that you found this approach worked particularly well for teaching computing. Can you say a bit more about what it was that worked particularly well for that topic?
Yeah, so I do a lot of, so it's part of the core support. A big part of that is computing, and what I would do, I would have a weekly drop-in session, which is on top of the labs for computing, where typically I would actually get up to about 50 students turning up to that, and it would just be me. And most of the time, the issues they would have would be quite specific, but not so specific that it's personal. So what it actually meant was, I somehow had to try and get round to all students. So I had roughly, 1 minute per student. And it turns out that about 5 of them actually had the same question, but they were sitting in different places. Whereas doing the same thing online, so people could post those questions in the chat, and I could just share my screen and, do some quick coding examples or, address the questions. And the students were particularly positive about that part of the webinar series. They found that, they'd been regular attendees at the in-person sessions, and the online ones, they just got so much more out of those and wished they'd been there all year. And so do I, actually, because I found it a lot less stressful doing it online.
Brilliant. Just say thanks again, Tom. You'll be online later. Yep. To answer kind of any questions that come through. But again, thanks for those, real personal insights. And I think that's been a strength of this program, is that colleagues are sharing their opinions of having to do this very, very quickly, and it's that kind of raw experience that I think is going to be so valuable for people to hear from. So thank you again, Tom.
Thank you very much. No problem.